Louis, this week on the What's Broken in GTM and How to Fix It podcast, we kick off our summer Cognoscenti series with a guest who brings a genuinely distinctive set of lenses to go-to-market leadership. We are speaking to JD Miller, operating partner at Rothschild 5 Arrows. What's the TLDL? Too long, didn't listen, for anyone who doesn't have time for the whole episode.
CROs can no longer rely on heroic selling, instinctive deal judgment, or a single forecast number. In a PE-backed environment, they have to understand the investment thesis, translate it into the revenue architecture, communicate early and clearly with the board, and explain not just whether the number will be hit, but why the system is performing the way it is. Now, AI doesn't remove that responsibility. If anything, it raises the standard. It can automate research, reporting, forecasting inputs, and administrative work, but it cannot replace trust, judgment, leadership, or the human dynamics of complex B2B buying.
Stay with us for the next 55 minutes or so to learn more. Hello and welcome to episode 52 of the What's Broken in GTM and How to Fix It podcast. I'm Simon Daniels.
And I'm Louis Fernandes.
We are exploring the challenges facing SaaS GTM leaders that Louis has been discussing in his newsletter, drilling into the topics a little further to provide some solid practical guidance for SaaS GTM success. Now, Louis, before we get into things, we've got a couple of public service announcements to make, so why don't you kick us off?
Yes, that's right. So it's been quite an exciting week for me. Together with my colleagues Kevin Brown and Travis Brown, who are not related, I've launched the Revenue Operating Governance working paper in conjunction with the folks at Winning by Design Growth Institute. Now, we formally launched it at the Winning by Design Impact Summit virtual a couple of days ago, where the three of us presented the core ideas. The paper looks at why well-designed revenue systems still break under pressure. And the argument is that revenue architecture gives us a system design and growth architecture helps us to understand how the system behaves. But what we really need is a governance layer that keeps the system aligned with incentives, short-term pressure, and local optimization, starting to pull it apart in a lot of organizations. It's also why the current What's Broken in GTM blog arc is focused on revenue governance. And the working paper sort of gives us a broader operating framework. And the blog series is kind of where I'm unpacking the individual principles in more detail.
Fantastic. It's a great piece of work, so highly recommended. On my
long piece of work.
Long piece of work. Well, yeah, that's for sure. So set aside a bit of time to go through that. As I say, so it's worth the investment. So on my part, I'm speaking at a couple of things, not one, but two events next week. I'll be at our own Accenture Song B2B Customer Growth Conference, where I'm talking about revenue planning. And in addition, I'll be at the SME Forum, which is a gathering for asset management, distribution, sales, and marketing leaders, where I'll be covering go-to-market measurement. So if anyone listening is in London on Monday or Tuesday and interested in either topic, let me know. I'll see if we can get you along.
That's really interesting stuff, Simon. I'm delighted that you're doing those things because I think they're important topics.
Yeah, I think so. And measurement obviously gets quite a bit of coverage, revenue planning less so, and that whole alignment piece. So all being well, there's some insights that I can be sharing there. Now, moving on, I'm delighted to say that for this episode, we are launching this year's Summer Cognoscenti interview series, last Monday having been the first day of summer. And our first guest is JD Miller, operating partner at Rothschild 5 Arrows. Now, last year we had a great run of guests and we're planning to speak to some more top go-to-market movers and shakers across the next couple of months. Louis, tell us a bit more about JD and why we wanted to speak to him.
Yeah, well as being a pro equity operating advisor at Rothschilds, he's also a multi-time CRO, having scaled and exited 5 businesses. He's worked with a lot of technology businesses, advising revenue leaders and portfolio companies on GTM strategy, value creation, operating performance, all the kind of things that we talk about on the blog and on the podcast. What's really interesting, though, and one of the reasons I really wanted to speak to JD, is he's the author of the CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity, and very recently, actually, the AI Handbook for Sales Professionals, which explores how sellers, managers, and executives can really apply AI practically across modern GTM work. I think that combined with the CRO experience, the P operating discipline and the AI perspective really make JD a particularly timely guest for this conversation.
Very much so. We only speak to the best.
Haha.
Let's get to it, shall we?
Let's do it. Okay, well, welcome to the What's Broken in GTM and How to Fix It podcast. JD Miller, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
One of the things that we wanted to sort of talk about today really was around the whole CRO relationship with private equity, how CROs operate under pressure of the investment thesis, some of the new stuff you've talked about in your new AI handbook. And I know we've had a few discussions in the past around these kind of things, but I was so enthused by the content that you came up with that time. I'm so delighted to have you here again so we can explore that a little bit further.
Absolutely. I think we'll have a great conversation. And I think it's a time that is really changing for sales professionals, whether you're a small company that's been acquired by private equity, whether you have nothing to do with that kind of investment, but you're a sales professional that's suddenly seeing AI in your workplace. This is a year that there's a lot of change happening.
Yeah. I mean, you've been through a number of exits yourself over the last, 15, 20 years. What have those exits taught you that is now being really front of mind as we go through all of these transitions with AI coming to the fore and so on? What have you taken from all of that?
Well, I actually think about the very first job I ever had out of college. I went to school thinking I was going to be an attorney and just fell into a role in a tech company that was backed by private equity. And we were a very small .com in the late 90s when business was booming and everyone was asking all of these questions about how is the world going to change when everyone has a website? And, I think a lot of those prognostications didn't come true, but the handful that did really fundamentally changed the way the world is. Fast forward a couple of jobs, and now all of a sudden we're having those same questions about AI, where every investment that I see happening in every tech company is figuring out how to put some sort of, .ai in their title there. And we're asking the same questions about how is AI going to change the world? I suspect it's going to be just like those early days where, a lot of the things we say are going to happen don't, but the handful that do, I think we'll look back in a few years and say, how could we have ever possibly lived or worked without this kind of stuff happening?
Hey, JD, it's Simon. Thanks again for joining the podcast. So that background that you mentioned there, it's pretty multifaceted, isn't it? You don't come from a kind of a pure sales hero background or tradition. You've got communications, social science, and so on. How does that change the way you think about complex B2B buying and the whole process around that?
Well, so actually coming out of school when that first sales job came up, I really thought I didn't want to be a salesperson at all because I was worried about what that would mean. And what I found really quickly is that all of those humanities and, group decision making, persuasion, relationship building, trust building, all really influenced how I became an individual contributor. And then of course, how I became a manager of salespeople. And so I think a lot of that kind of humanities, communication science has always been at the core of sales, figuring out how to rally groups of people around ideas. You've got all different kinds of decision makers, in a buying group. And there's lots of interpersonal dynamics that have nothing to do with ROI calculations or board slides or the rest of that. So I've always seen that really closely connected. And now as I've started to work on, the research for this book about AI, I'm coming back to those core humanities again and saying, yes, there are all sorts of processes and reporting things that AI can help us with. But also at the end of the day, sales is fundamentally humans connecting with one another on interpersonal agendas. And so, I think those communication skills and that social science is even more relevant today than it maybe had been before.
And you mentioned buying groups. Do you think the dynamic around buying groups has changed since you've been doing this? Because obviously, we talk about it on the podcast a lot. There's a great deal spoken and written, and I've certainly contributed to that, about buying groups and the importance of engaging complex B2B purchases as a group and not an individual, and certainly not just an individual lead and so on. Has that always been the case in your experience, and we're just kind of coming to realize that now, or has that actually changed over time, do you think?
So I think it's always been there, but I think it's become harder to do, which is maybe why we're talking about it more. When I first began selling enterprise software, we always talked about mapping all of the people who are going to be involved in a decision and recognizing that, there are people who are involved in the strategy and there are people involved in the IT sign off and the CFO organization is signing off on ROI. And we also knew that sometimes decisions were just made interpersonally because, you know, Simon is the person who's going to make his career on this. And so, regardless of whose technology is best, you know, there's some interpersonal reason that he needs to do the project or not do the project. I think in the last few years, certainly post COVID, we've become a much more virtual kind of workforce. And so you don't get all of those people in the same room anymore. They're often to each other, just, different faces and kind of the Brady Bunch boxes on the screen. And so it's harder for them to understand their interpersonal dynamics because as soon as the sales call is done, they've hung up and they're back off in their homes and they're not talking to one another anymore. And so I do think that, that's becoming harder to, identify what the politics are and then navigate those.
And that's kind of interesting because, again, the people that have been able to do that best, certainly in the last 2-3 decades, ended up generally as those hero style sellers that were, top of the team kind of thing. One of the things Simon and I have talked a lot about is how we don't think actually that heroics really is the way forward for a lot of businesses. And I think that maybe has changed over time. And I think that's especially true as you start transitioning into leadership roles, and particularly as the chief revenue officer in an organization. My question to you, I guess, then is, having gone through that from a frontline seller yourself to then leading teams to then being a CRO multiple times, at what point do you realize that transition is happening and it's no longer about being the hero, it's about managing the system?
I love this topic. So I think you're exactly right that the top seller gets there for, any number of reasons, but they're very good at sales and they're very good at this relationship building. And then either because they want a title or they want more money or they want some prestige, somehow they get convinced, or they convince other people to promote them into team leader. And the roles of team leader are completely different because that leadership role is now all about management and inspiration and training other people to do what you did naturally well. And so I think the skills and the things that they do fundamentally change. I think the other thing it used to mean is that they suddenly become managers of data and not managers of people. Now you're really tied up in forecasting and, what deals are going to be in and what deals are going to be out. And, it's a step removed from the customer themselves and all of that interpersonal interaction that you used to be great at. I think what's interesting about now AI is starting to automate a lot of that, forecasting and data collection and those sorts of things, which really leaves the leaders a lot of time and opportunity to go back to interpersonal coaching of their rep, doing more ride-alongs with the salesperson, and getting back into all of those kind of interpersonal dynamics of deals. And so it's a bit of a pendulum that swung, really far one way and maybe is coming back a little bit backwards too.
Yeah. I want to come back to forecasting a little bit later on in our discussion, because I think it's an interesting topic, especially how sometimes it gets construed versus what it actually in reality really is. But we'll park that for now. One of the things that I think is interesting, though, is as you move into that whole leadership role, and there is that distinction between leadership and management, and the further up the greasy pole you go, it becomes more about the leadership, right?
That's right.
But again, as you start moving into those upper echelons, and we've discussed this previously, the go-to-market mission, in some respects, becomes subordinate to that investment thesis. And when you're in that leadership role, you're thinking much more about the investment thesis that maybe an investor has. And I still get the impression that a lot of CROs don't fully understand what their role is in the investment thesis and still revert back to the tactical management of the teams. What is it the CROs are failing to understand there, do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of empathy going on. And I think if they've grown up through the sales ranks, when you were an individual contributor seller, you didn't often know very much about the strategy or the investment thesis of the company. You knew I have a comp plan, it pays me these rates when I sell these things, and I've got to go sell those deals and maximize my compensation. I think a lot of CROs, and for me, it's so clear because I've always worked in private equity backed businesses. But even if you're a public company, you've got shareholders, or privately held business, you've got a board of directors that you're responding to.
Yeah.
You may have a strategic direction that says, in order to get more profitability, we want to go capture this market share over here, and we want to stop selling this unprofitable thing. And so, the strategy may be something like that. Now, an individual seller, if their comp plan hasn't yet been adjusted to say, sell more of this product, sell less of that product, don't understand, and they get anxious about, why do I keep bringing you all these little deals or these unprofitable deals and you're mad at me? And so I think a lot of times CROs who've grown up through the ranks that maybe haven't, figured out the strategic side of it yet, and they're still thinking in the brains of their individual contributor role, is kind of saying, well, how can we do this deal, and how can I maximize revenue here? And any revenue is good revenue, without, fully comprehending, I need to lead the whole organization through that change. And it does mean that the strategy that, everyone develops in the boardroom, now the CRO has to carry forward and articulate it to the organization, make sure they know what it is, but also make sure the systems and the processes and the comp plans are supporting that so that everyone's motivations are aligned in the same way.
We've spoken about that a lot on this podcast, about compensation driving behavior. It's like the big shock. Who knew? But it's this idea of not just aligning incentives, I think, within the sales team, but the broader organization. So the strategic direction is always true. And I think that's something that often gets missed. But speaking of missing things, I mean, I think the other thing I've heard you say before is that CROs don't necessarily get fired for missing the number. They get fired for failing to explain what's happening. And that'd be great maybe for the audience to hear how you unpack what you mean by that.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, the CRO, as a member of the leadership team, has to collaborate and say, here's how much money is coming into the business. And then they and the board and their, executive team can decide, what are we going to do with this money? Are we going to build new products? Are we going to hire more people? Is it going to be a leaner year where we, can't spend all of that money? I think a lot of times, a CRO might begin the year with a plan that says we're going to do $100 million. And they realize early on that actually it's only going to be 90 or 92 million. If they come to the table early on and they talk to all of those constituents and say, we're only going to do 92 million for whatever reason, that can be okay because the board has time to react, the executive team has time to react, and we adjust our spending and we do all of those things. I think what happens a lot of times, though, is that individual contributor who grew up to be CRO is afraid to deliver bad news and doesn't want to say we're going to miss the number. And so they keep quiet about it. And they keep promising we're going to hit that $1 million, we're going to hit that $100 million. And in their mind, they're thinking, I don't really know how that's going to happen, but hopefully we're going to get lucky and something's going to work out and I'm going to, work really hard and all of these things. And then they get to the end of the year and they just deliver the 92 that they talked about. And now their board and the executive team is like, well, wow, it's so late in the year. We have nothing that we can do but close these offices and fire these people because that's the only way that we can, get to the result. And so, the CROs, and this is why forecasting is so important. The CRO who can tell you what's going to happen early on, I think has a ton of longevity, regardless of the number that they actually wind up delivering.
What's the best way of handling that kind of early escalation situation? Because that's an uncomfortable conversation, isn't it, for a CRO or a revenue leader to go to the rest of the executive leadership and the board and say, it looks like we're going to miss. Are there any approaches that they should take? It's a little bit of a kind of don't bring me problems, bring me solutions type of situation, isn't it? So how do you handle that if there isn't necessarily a solution? You're literally saying we're not going to hit it. How should a revenue leader think about that?
Yeah. So I talk a lot about this in my first book, The CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity. And I think it begins with having a conversation, not just about what is the number, but all of the components that add up to that. So we should never just sign up for a quota for the year and say, we're going to sell $100 million and we'll figure it out along the way. We actually, when we all align that 100 million is the target, we need to work very closely with everyone else to say, here are all the components. And this is where a great RevOps professional is going to be helpful too. So I always love to have a good RevOps team. Of that 100 million, the first 70 million of it is our install base. We think that, we're going to churn this many customers, but we're going to add price increases. And so that's how we get there. Then, here's how much revenue we think our, standard teams in mid-market sales can do. Here's how many that we think our enterprise teams can do. We're going to launch that new product in June. Here's how much revenue of the 100 million is going to come from that new product. So that when we start the year, we're not just signing up for a number, but we sort of enrolled everyone in all of those components. And then when you're missing, you can go back to each of those components and explain why and say, we're not hitting the expectations in our mid-market team. Let's think about what's happening there. Our customers are churning more often than we expected. What's happening with customer sat? Oh, that new product was 4 months delayed, and that's explaining why. So coming and saying you're missing the number, without anything behind it, yes, is difficult. If you can ground it in, here are the assumptions we all agreed to. Here's what's different about reality. And now, how do we want to course correct? I think it's much easier.
That's so interesting because I'm actually speaking at our Rethink client conference in a couple of weeks' time on revenue planning, which is essentially what you just described, the process of breaking down the 100 million and saying, where is that actually going to come from? Which segments, which geographies, what element of it is going to be acquisition versus expansion and retention and so on. And really part of what I'm saying is that if you think that, once you've done all that analysis, even at the planning stage, you might determine, what we set off thinking we might get 10, 15 million in this segment. And actually, as we look at it, that doesn't seem realistic. It's only going to be 10. So if we want to hit 100, we've got to get a 5 somewhere else. And then once you're executing, if you start thinking it's going to be a miss, you can start saying, well, can we put that somewhere else? Can we make up for it somewhere else? Or like you say, you can say, well, these are the assumptions that we made. They're not proving out in real life. That's why we've got this problem. But at least you can keep on top of it and understand where the problem's coming from, as opposed to it just being a big number and not meeting that big number. I wanted to pick up on what you were saying about RevOps as well. Thank you for putting a nice word in. What is the role of RevOps here, both in that scenario, but also more broadly in terms of translating the kind of investment thesis into operational metrics and the processes and cadences? How do you work with RevOps, or how do you recommend portfolio companies and so on work with RevOps to get those things done?
Well, I've always been fortunate to have a good RevOps leader who understands sales, but also really understands math and finance. And I think a lot of times when I look at the CROs that I work with, especially those that have come up through the ranks of selling, they don't really understand sophisticated spreadsheet work, and they don't understand, how to read a P&L all the time. And so a lot of times I think, RevOps is a good translator between the business strategy and what's the data telling us, and, how does this adjust? And so I think what's really exciting is, when I first started getting religion about RevOps, it was probably 12 years ago. And that was a lot of intense work that both of us were doing, manually in spreadsheet and calculations, and, reforecasting would take us days and weeks. And, it was a long, long process. I think what's exciting is a lot of the tooling has come along, and AI tools are helping a lot of that. And so now we get much more sophistication in the ability to kind of turn these analyses around quicker. And we can actually run multiple iterations and say, what if this happens? What if this happens? let's look at the forecast again. And, let's start getting windows of what's likely to happen and so on and so forth. I think the result then is, if the RevOps leader and their team isn't doing all of the math work, now they're even more involved in the strategic conversations about, we've run the math, here's 5 different ways that might work out, and what are we going to do about it? And so they're becoming much more closely aligned with the leadership of the strategy and, where to go next.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And it's something that we've spoken quite a lot about on the pod previously around probabilistic forecasting rather than just, a forecast is a number at a fixed point in time. We all know it's not.
Right.
And I think a lot of revenue leaders maybe are uncomfortable with that idea of saying, actually, there are a range of possible outcomes. These are the probabilities that there are of hitting these ranges, and actually looking at it not just in terms of that one number, as you rightly say, JD. I mean, it's almost the different sales motions have got their different ways of working. The different channels will work differently as well. So it's almost saying, do we have a forecast for each one of those channels and a forecast for each one of those sales motions? And then by bringing them together, that's how we end up as our overarching number. But each one has a probability. And to your point, we can then rightly say, these are the things we can see that maybe are going our way, and these are the things we can see that maybe aren't.
Yeah.
How does that then affect our overall outcome as we move towards that final sort of finish line for that quarter? Have you sort of used those kind of probabilistic ways of working with your RevOps partners to sort of say, this is how we construct a forecast?
So I love that you're talking about this. I definitely think we should do it a lot more than we do. And I have always talked about the analogy. I love the word forecast, and I was thinking about weather forecasting. So, going back to where we started, is it hard to deliver bad news? Well, my news anchor doesn't have a hard time getting on TV and saying, there's a 90% chance of rain today. They just deliver it. But what's also really interesting is they do say it's a 90% chance of rain. And so, I would take my umbrella, but 10% of the time I'm going to be wrong. And I think we need to think about that in sales forecasting as well. I love this probability kind of approach of 85% of the time we're going to reach at least this much revenue. If everything's hitting on all cylinders, we're going to hit here. It's highly unlikely we're going to get to the best case stretch goal. And so now let's have a conversation about what's your level of comfort and how much of an umbrella do you think you need or don't need to move forward with the next part of the, the quarter.
Yeah. And I think it's also one of these things that you can sort of look back at previous data very easily, so that you're looking at things like, what is the time delta that we have in each stage, so that we've got confidence that things are moving along the pipeline at the rate that they need to. We can look at conversion rates by stage as well, so that we can say, actually, now that we have the confidence of what's happened historically and we understand how our revenue engine operates, that gives us more confidence in what we're saying that we believe something will end up at. Less so about I think it's going to end up here because my man Bob tells me that this deal's going to happen.
Right. Well, and this is where I'm so excited about what AI is doing. And, in my new book, it's called the AI Handbook for Sales Professionals. We talk about some of these tools.
Which I loved, by the way. I thought it was an excellent piece of work.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. But you think about, 10 years ago, how did we do this forecasting? Well, we didn't have the computing power to do a whole lot of sophisticated analysis. And so we just had this very rudimentary 90% of our stage 5 deals close, 60% of our stage 3 deals close, 5% of our stage 2 deals close. And that's all that you had the computing power, the capacity, and the time to calculate. And you got some sort of a result that, maybe it was good, maybe it wasn't. And, we kind of got there. Well, now let's go back to that social science background. I know that, groups make decisions in certain kinds of ways. And our sales methodologies, like MedPix, knows that, deals don't close until you have identified the economic buyer and done an ROI calculation and, figured out the legal paper process and how many days it takes and all of that stuff. And we never used to get insight into all of that kind of stuff. Well, now today, every call is recorded and transcribed, and you can feed that into an LLM. And so even if JD isn't sitting on every sales call, the AI tool is sitting on every sales call, and we can get a lot more sophisticated in the models we run about for every deal in our pipeline right now, which of these criteria are met, which aren't, and just get, much more granularity in our forecasts. But I think they're going to get better and better and better.
And how does that then change the requirements of both CROs and RevOps professionals in terms of what they should be asking for in terms of the data inputs that they're seeking from the business, and also how to use those data inputs?
Yeah. Well, so I think this is what you talked about earlier about the difference between management and leadership, because now if I'm not spending 30 hours of my week trying to call what the number is going to be, I have 30 hours a week to analyze why is the number what it's going to be and what should we do about it. And so, I think we do need to, and I think, the AI industry and the sales tech industry, still has to coalesce around really what are the most important data points. And, I'm a social scientist. I care about communication stuff, but, we'll talk for a long time about what the predictor variables are. But I think once we've aligned on what those things are, the leader, the CRO is now going to spend a lot more of their time, responding to it. And so if I'm creating a forecast that says most of these deals aren't happening because we're not getting to power, or because all of a sudden we're losing to, uncertainty about the economy or something like that, well, now I better spend a whole lot of my time figuring out how to train my team to deal with those things, how to think about my messaging in a different way, maybe collaborating with product on, we're starting to identify all of this, new capability that we never knew about, and let's go build this product that's going to get us there. So I think it lets RevOps and it lets sales leadership become a lot more strategic in what should we do next, instead of just being drones who come to the office every day and open the window and tell you it's raining or it's going to rain tomorrow.
I have to say, I'm kind of with you on the social science side of things, because for me, sales has always been about understanding the psychology of the buying, committee, the buying personas that you're interacting with. And I think you're absolutely right. The sophistication of the tools now from a conversational intelligence point of view, to be able to start pulling that information so that AIs can then start saying with a level of confidence, this is where you really sit within the deal, because we're looking for the buying signals, we're looking for the attitudes, we're looking for all of those kind of things. I think it's amazing stuff to be able to do. And I think you're absolutely right. The more we can not delegate, because I think the whole point of the human condition is that we as human beings still need to have exercise judgment and critical thinking. But a lot of the background data that maybe we miss because we're too busy in the moment is now all being collected and can be parsed later to give us those insights that we can then do something with.
So yeah, I'm a huge advocate for this notion of humanity in everything that we're doing. I just gave a TED Talk and it was called Reclaiming Our Humanity in the Age of the Algorithm. And in it, I tell a story about my garden. And here in the US, that's like a vegetable patch for you. So I lived in an apartment that had a very small little balcony overlooking an alley with trash cans, but I filled it with a bunch of, potted tomatoes and cucumbers and you would say aubergines, I suppose. And I started taking pictures of all of this and posting them on Instagram. Well, and I jokingly shared it with friends as this, the Chicago Bell Garden, the hottest new bistro in Chicago. Well, someone sales algorithm tool came and scraped my Instagram and decided that I must be a real restaurant and a vegan food influencer at that. And all of a sudden my door is filling up with cases of vegan cookies and industrial sized tubs of kimchi to sample. A vendor sent me 120 pounds of steak rub, all for consideration in, the Chicago Bell Gardens menu. This is a place where a human in the loop would have very quickly realized, they would have seen the picture of my little balcony and my 3 little tomato plants and realized this is not a sales prospect for us. Don't spend any more time there. But they let their algorithms get so far ahead of their skis that, it's automated all of these things. And, it's actually become hard for me to stop all of those things coming to my door, but they're also wasting tons and tons of money, pursuing a customer they're never going to win.
And so what's the role of RevOps in that balance between AI and human in the loop, and how should that be managed? What's the kind of impact of AI on RevOps delivery for the wider revenue ecosystem, how should, revenue operations leaders in particular be approaching that?
Well, so I think RevOps really has a huge voice at the table of defining the process by which we go to market. And so, working with marketing and sales and everyone else to sort of lay out, this is the way we pursue deals. These are the data elements that we're looking at. And these are the places that we can automate. But just as importantly, these are the places we should never be automating. And I think RevOps, sits in a unique intersection between all of these different organizations, that they often have the visibility of what's marketing doing, what's product doing, what's finance doing. So they're probably very well positioned to have insight into where are we ripe for AI and where are we not. Personally, for me, I always come back to this idea that sales is about human engagement. And so anytime we're trying to build trust, we're trying to build consensus, we're doing perspective taking, we're doing relationship building, that's not something we want to automate. I do think AI can play a great role there. AI can certainly do a great job at finding everything you've ever written online and researching your company's website and giving me an awesome prep in 2 minutes to show up, on your sales call, knowledgeable about a lot of things. But then it still has to be a human in the room who, tests things and realizes, oh, actually, we hallucinated that. You didn't just, acquire a company or launch a new product or whatever, and respond and, adjust as the sales process goes forwards.
And you talked a few minutes ago about the role of AI in reporting and, well, specifically forecasting, but perhaps more widely reporting, and the greater kind of compute power and so on that we have. RevOps has a tendency, or at least there's a risk of it being reduced to the kind of reporting department or function. So thinking more broadly about AI and the role of RevOps, how should that be avoided? And like you say, sitting at that intersection with the perspective and kind of oversight that RevOps has, or certainly can have, what are the ways that can be leveraged, and how should RevOps avoid falling into that trap of just becoming a kind of one-dimensional reporting machine at the expense of all the other things that they can and should be doing?
Yeah. Well, I think it's by making themselves the ultimate customer of all of those products and all of those projects. I think about a company I worked for that was in the business of producing analyst reports. And they had been producing these reports for decades and decades and decades. And there was a person in the organization whose job had evolved into looking at all of the scatter plots, pulling out the outlying data points and drawing the trend line. And for many years, they were the only person in the organization who knew how to do that. And so they had this immense value. Well, all of a sudden, something came along and Microsoft Excel said, we can pull out outliers and we can write trend lines, and your job is completely unnecessary. They could have done two things. They could have doubled down on saying, I'm the only person who can draw the trend line and now I'm out of a job. Or they could have evolved into the next role, which is, okay, great. If that's all been automated, now I can start being the only person in the room who explains why the trend is what it is. And I think the same analogy exists for RevOps, which is, if your only value is I'm the person who can pull the board pack together or who can run the weekly flash report, that maybe was very important 5 years ago. Very quickly, you're going to find yourself obsolete. RevOps, I think, needs to continue to evolve into being the person that explains, why does the report say what it is? What led to, this outcome? What are all of the options we can do to change the outcome? And that's really how value is added.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, one of the things that I really loved about the book and talking about the different stages of AI was the fact that when you're talking about the different ways that AI gets applied, you've been very, very cognizant of talking about, different levels of maturity and thinking about this is sort of stage 1, this is stage 2, this is stage 3, this is stage 4. So, and I think that that's a really important recognition about where organizations are on their evolution. And I think you've done that in a really sympathetic way. But taking this now to the points you were just making about board packs, and this is something that I'm really quite interested in. How do you think CROs can be taking all this huge slew of data that comes from all manner of things, whether it's, this is how product usage that I'm getting, this is how the revenue's flowing through the entire engine, these are the conversions that we're getting, these are the segments that are doing particularly well, these are the ones that aren't. How are they supposed to be using this to prepare those board packs and have those genuinely interactive conversations with their boards and investors rather than it just becoming performance theater?
Well, I think two things there. The first is, I think it becomes very important for the CRO to be the owner of the narrative and really manage the board's expectations in a very prescriptive way. Boards always want to be in my business. They always want to, dive into the data and look at this and look at that. And I think on one hand, AI is really great at giving us the ability to do that. If we're not careful, though, the CRO becomes irrelevant by just saying, here's all my data, and board, you can go answer any questions you want. And here's this little LLM, and you can, interact with all the data and do all your what if thing. And they completely have made themselves irrelevant there. And I think boards that get over involved, land at bad decisions because they lack the context of being in the business day to day. A board member loves to see one data point on a chart and declare that this is, the solution, and, absent any context, they're the most brilliant person in the room, and they could steer the business in the wrong way. So I think with this ability to use AI to rapidly, create board packs and have interactive scenario building and all of that stuff, also comes a responsibility for the CRO to say, but I own the story and I'm owning the box and I'm keeping the board in the box and not just giving them free rein there. The second thing I want to go back to where you began your question, though, is this sophistication journey, because we have the luxury every day of talking about AI and tools and all of this kind of stuff. And it's easy to fall into the trap that thinks everybody's doing this already. And actually, a Pew Research study at the end of last year, so, 6 months ago, maybe a little dated, said only 18% of American workers were using AI in their jobs at all at the end of 2025. And so it is important that even though we're thinking about all the great end states of how could AI, make the board experience amazing and make my marketing experience and all of those stuff, we have to recognize that most people, and maybe most of your listeners, haven't even started the journey yet. And so we do need to kind of take some bite-sized steps of, crawl, walk, run. And if you go to my website, jdmillerphd.com, you'll find bonus materials for the book, totally free to download. That'll give you sort of a 90-day plan to go from no AI at all to completely knowing AI and having some of these experiments integrated in your business.
We'll definitely put that into the show notes so that people can find it online. That's great. I mean, the other thing that I was going to just say that dovetails into this is that, again, that level of sophistication, one of the things that came out, and I think you were part of this report as well, that you contributed to with Wayne Starrett at Bullingstone. And he's a friend of the show and he's been on before as well. So one of the things that I was really interested in was that there was this whole point around CROs needing that AI literacy. And I'm curious to know what will separate the best CROs, do you think, from the mediocre ones in this new AI-enabled GTM environment?
I think it is going to be getting really comfortable with the technology really quickly. I'm old enough that I came out of college in the late 90s. I was one of the first classes to graduate from the University of Illinois with an email address. And so when I showed up at my first job, I had colleagues who were still typing memos, photocopying them, and sticking them under people's doors or in cubby holes. And all of a sudden, here were all of these, 22-year-olds who were getting work done so much faster because we could email each other really quickly and, not route it through the manila envelope. I think we're going to see the same thing happen with AI, where, AI is probably not running all of our businesses today, but in 2 or 3 years, the people who have no clue how to query an LLM or, get it involved in some of these data intensive tasks are going to really quickly find themselves left behind. And so I think the CROs, who distinguish themselves today, yes, they're the ones who have great board communication and can forecast really accurately and deliver what they say they're going to do. But boy, they better be paddling like heck underneath the water to, develop their skills. And the cool thing about AI is you can sit down with the chat prompt and ask it to teach you. Dear Chat GPT, I've never used you before, and I'm a sales leader. Give me some homework assignments, and it'll begin a conversation.
I'm just having nostalgic flashbacks to manila envelopes. Back in the day, I remember when I first started in agency land, we had job bags. That's how long ago that was. Thankfully, we'd moved beyond carrier pigeons. But anyway, that's a different conversation.
I love it.
So I think one of the things that we're coming to very, very clearly here is that it's great to have AI as part of the mix. The humanity side of things is still vitally important because people like to buy from people. They like to be led by people. And ultimately, we are human in the very human sense of that word.
Right.
And I think it's important to recognize those kind of things. So one of the things that I'm coming to the conclusion is that AI is not a substitute for great leadership.
Absolutely not.
Right. And we need to still encourage our people to have those great leadership skills. Now, talking about leadership, one of the things that's very clear to me is that there is a danger that we end up not having people capable of becoming leaders in the future, because we've seen it a lot that a lot of organizations are adopting AI as a way of taking, and you've spoken about this, the lowest cost alternative for doing a particular role. And I absolutely understand the economic argument for it. Maybe you can talk to that, but then also tell me a little bit about how you see organizations still bringing in talent so that we then have the next generation of people ready to do these kind of jobs. Because if that all goes, we're building a house of cards.
Well, I'll begin with my bias, which is I have a PhD in communication and I'm a social scientist. And so I've always liked the liberal arts degrees. But I really do believe that in the past, we've all put up with bad leaders because they were very good technicians. And so, we've worked for the CEO or the CROs who had really terrible people skills, but they were awesome at manipulating data and, doing that work, moved them ahead and made them indispensable to the organization. I think as AI takes on all of those tasks, that's going to expose those, quote, leaders for what they were. Because when you don't have to occupy your time with spreadsheets and manipulating data, all that's left is leading, empowering, inspiring, training, teaching the rest of the team.
Yep.
And so I do think that's where the future is. How do we get there? Like any other skill, it's a skill that we need to reward and prize and develop in the organization. You may not know how to, build great trusting relationships. Well, the good news is that is a skill that can be taught, and your frontline manager or your leader can go on sales calls with you and show you how and teach you how and coach you how and work on it. But it's going to take all of us being really intentional on that kind of return to the social sciences and the soft skills and valuing them just as much as we did the technical ones. I also think I'm going to add something else here. In our BDR ranks, when we think about the brand new hires, it used to be that a first-time seller rose up through the BDR ranks because they were the person who could sit down in a chair and dial the phone 100 times or chunk through a whole lot of data and send out 100 emails. Very quickly, that's not going to be the skill that gets you promoted out of being a BDR because AI can automate that kind of work. It's going to be a return to who are the BDRs who have developed these social skills that when I get you on the phone, can I develop a rapport with you and trust with you and grow on that relationship?
And so zooming out from that, perhaps, and thinking about the revenue leadership and what boards are looking for from CROs, particularly go back to what we were saying when that number perhaps is going to be missed. What should CROs be doing when the revenue system is under pressure? And boards are perhaps putting CROs under pressure. And I guess touching back on the last couple of minutes of the conversation, thinking about it from a leadership perspective, all the way from senior sales leadership, all the way through to frontline individual contributors and BDRs and so on. How should CROs be kind of rallying the entire organization in that kind of situation?
Well, I think it's recognizing that they are that football coach who needs to rally the losing team and really get good at explaining, why it is, what's going to change about it, and how things can move us forward. There are a lot of tactical things you can do there. I've unfortunately had many fourth quarters that I look at the forecast and say, we're completely going to miss our number and we're not going to get there. But I've really got to inspire my sales team that even if they're not going to hit their quota, I want them to stay and work hard and do everything I can and stop looking for new jobs. And so, that role becomes about, what's the short-term incentive that I can roll out that says, even if you don't get your quota, if you can do these 3 things this quarter, you're going to earn some incentive. It is about rallying folks around a vision for the future that we're just 3 months away from the start of the new year when all this exciting new stuff is going to happen and we're going to be a winning team again. But it's, it comes back to that group consensus and group motivation stuff about understanding the perspective of all of the people in the team, knowing what they care about, delivering messages that resonate with them, and then putting in all of the compensation and other kinds of systems that support the message that you say you want delivered to them.
It's kind of interesting. It's almost the whole rallying cry of there's a TV series here on the UK at the moment that BBC are putting out called Dear England, and it's based on a successive number of campaigns. I'm not a particular football fan, but actually it's really interesting because of the psychological side of things and rallying the troops and getting them to that point whereby they're starting to believe in themselves and win the games. And I just thought it was brilliant. And it follows the story of Gareth Southgate for international listeners, who was the England coach for a number of campaigns and was very successful. So, look, JD, it's been fantastic having you on the show. I would love to get you back again to talk more, but I'm afraid we're sort of coming to the end of it. Are there any final thoughts that you have that you'd maybe like to share with our audience?
So I think, ending where we began, which is it's a really exciting time for organizations and professional salespeople today. Lots of things have changed, whether you've changed ownership, you have a private equity investment, or a company wrestling with AI. What's most important is that you embrace the change. You commit to learning. You commit to doing something different tomorrow than you have before. And you commit to doubling down on the things that make you unique, which often is your personal humanity. And if we do those things, we're going to have a great future together.
Brilliant. JD Miller, thank you so much for joining Simon and myself. It's been an absolute delight to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Louis, fantastic conversation as we anticipated. How would you tie up the discussion with JD?
I really enjoyed speaking with JD today, actually. I thought it was great. For me, I think it sort of breaks down into 5 different bits. The first big takeaway, and this is nothing new, but the CRO does fundamentally change as company scales. JD made the point that the skills that make someone a top seller do not automatically make them a great sales leader. And from a great sales leader to becoming a great CRO is another step, because you're no longer managing teams, you're managing expectations of your board, of your investors, as much as leading the go-to-market function. So that's a big thing. The second takeaway for me was really that forecasting is not a performance theatre exercise. It really is a management conversation. The issue is not only what is the number, it is what are the assumptions that created the number, what has changed, and what can we do about it now? And I think this is where it almost ties into some of the work that we've been doing on the revenue governance piece, because it's about how do you affect the longer term and make sure that you got that consistency. Now, the third thing really, and it ties into JD's book around AI, is that yes, we know that AI is powerful, but the important question is where should it be used? While I acknowledge, it can be used for research, deal intelligence, call analysis, even the forecasting and meeting preparations that we were talking about, and ultimately things like board pack production, it shouldn't replace the innately human things that we really do in this kind of a role, especially in sales. All the trust building, the consensus creation, the human judgment, those kind of things. And I think it also ties back to something that one of our previous Cognoscenti guests last year talked about a lot, and that was Joel Harrison. The whole trust piece is absolutely central, and that's innately human. The fourth takeaway really was that as AI takes on more of the work, what really remains for CROs is the actual leadership piece. And this goes back to something that Andy Champion always talks about. It's the inspiring, the coaching, the teaching, the development, communicating and helping people navigate change, those kind of things, and being that support mechanism. So I think in summary, for me, the future CRO is not that traditional heroic closer that we maybe saw 10, 15, 20 years ago. The future CRO is not only the architect, but the interpreter of the go-to-market system.
And those are our takeaways for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to episode 52 of the What's Broken in GTM and How to Fix It podcast. Check out our LinkedIn page where you can find show notes relating to the episode. You can get in touch with us via LinkedIn and follow us for regular updates. And don't forget to subscribe in your preferred podcast app to make sure you don't miss an episode. Next time, we will be speaking to our next Summer Cognoscenti series guest, mentioned at the top of the episode, Travis Brown, CXO at Opinion, so please join us. Next time, we will be speaking to our next Summer Cognoscenti series guest, mentioned at the top of the episode, Kevin Brown, a founder at SM View, so please join us. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Simon Daniels.
And it's goodbye from me, Louis Fernandes. Have a fantastic day.